Okay.
Okay, looks like we're all ready to go.
Yep, ready when you are.
So welcome everybody. I'm just here today to have a quick chat with Robin. If I explain to Robin, I do a bulletin every week or most weeks about different PIE stuff, and I was about to do one about why we're using PIE 2.0 and the reasons behind that, and then I thought, why don't I just ask Robin if he'd do a video with me rather than me writing it all out? So, but maybe before we get to that sort of evolution side of it, maybe if you just want to tell the organisation who you are and why I'm talking to you today.
Okay, well, yes, I'm Robin. These days, I suppose I'm mainly the editor of this community practice website, the PIE Link. So I write a lot of the material, or I gather it and put it on there. And that includes running a number of what we call a lunchtime forum, kind of fairly informal discussions, conversations, and so on. Probably going to be doing webinars at some point as we kind of scale up. But this is basically, I continue doing this because I was the guy that first came up with the idea, with the word, psychologically informed environment, but also with the whole idea that we were trying to get at. And ever since then, people kept asking me, what exactly does it mean? And how do we do it? Or how do we know if we are one? And so I've ended up just trying to respond as best I can. And the thing is, the more I add about, oh, well, I can know people are doing this and some people are doing that, the more the thing develops and grows anyway.
Yeah.
So it is very much a sort of dynamic interaction, as I see it, between the people with the ideas and people out there in the real world who are taking those ideas and then being really inventive and creative and coming up with something I hadn't even imagined originally. And that's one of the reasons I'm getting around to answering your first question about PIEs too. When I first came up with the term PIE, it was about 2010, I suppose, 2011. And it got written into a couple of government documents and so on. And about 2013 or so, I did some workshops where I tried to sort of spell out what the main issues were as I saw it. And that's where you got that first way of looking at 5 different main themes that seem to come up a lot. And that's what we now call PIEs 1. And what happened was that as soon as I kind of put that out and started going to conferences or whatever about it, people started taking the idea and running with it and developing new sort of kind of inspired by, rather than just kind of strictly following the stuff that I'd originally only just tried to sum up.
Yeah.
Anyway, and after a few years, it became clear that actually what people were doing with this idea was bigger and broader and facing new kind of challenges, particularly around more systemic stuff and sort of working with other agencies and more user involvement and co-production, all the things that weren't actually mentioned much in the original version. So that's why I then thought, well, we need to come up with a new framework. And that I wanted a self-assessment framework. This is turning into a long answer right now.
I mean, I suppose before we get there, I guess I should sort of say that how I came to yourself, I suppose, how I came to find you was when I started this job last year. We as the organisation had been sort of on our PIE journey since 2016, and we'd been using PIEs 1 or the classic framework, whatever you want to call it. And
as most people were.
And I had my thoughts on what had come before, should we say, and the challenges within it. And I'm thinking, you know, there's certain things that work for us, certain things that don't. And I sort of sent out a big survey to the organisation, and my thinking was kind of reflected in the response that I got from that. So it sort of led me to look for other options. And you'll never forgive me if I don't mention it, but Kenny, who took over from me as managing in Aberystwyth, sort of pointed me in your direction because he'd been on the PIE Link for a while. And that's where I then found, you know, the evolved PIE 2.0 framework that seemed to me to answer some of the challenges that we'd come across, really. So I don't know if I think when we've spoken before, you've kind of spoken about that's how it evolved as well, trying to address some of the challenges with the first one, I guess.
Yeah. Well, like any software, you find bugs in the original version, and so you produce an update, an upgrade that tries to sort out some of the bugs. And of course, they always create other ones. So after a while, it just becomes a kind of continuous cycle of learning by doing and so on.
I mean, one of the ones that that came across quite strongly with us is that what had come before was really very heavily focused on the physical environment and services with buildings, which, and PIE 2.0, you sort of shift away from that, don't you, to call it spaces of opportunity, and it, to allow you to think about all the spaces engagement includes.
I mean, that was partly just a reflection of what I found, what I heard was happening, because when people would sign in and register on the PIE link, they would tell me what they were doing. And I was getting more and more people who are outreach workers, and they don't have a building. I mean, they may be trying to connect with other people's buildings, but they're using the physical space to engage somebody with a similar kind of understanding. And there's some wonderful examples I knew of projects where, they did have a building, but they would do a lot of their work, even with their residents, with their people who are part of their community. They would have discussions in a local coffee bar or in the park, or they'd take youngsters out into the woods, because they inner city kids who'd never actually been out. So they were using the environment. There was a fabulous article, blog post originally written by somebody from Fulfilling Lives up in Stoke, I've never actually managed to speak to yet, about using her car. And what she said was, I pick somebody up, I take them to somewhere. As soon as we get in the car, we're in a different physical space. And she was very conscious of how she was using the space of her car as a way to shift the relation. Stuff like that didn't really fit in with the original version, which is all about building. I mean, buildings really, really important. I don't mean to say they're not. And I'd love to have more on buildings. But people were using the same ideas, and inspired by that, they were doing something new and creative. And I just wanted to keep the ideas open, and interactive, and so on.
Yeah, I suppose some of the other stuff that challenges we found, I believe, with the classic framework was, the sort of the language of it, the psychological framework and evidence generating practice. Evidence generating practice in particular was always one, in all the different sort of training and explanations that we come across, was never really explained very well, sort of thing, and obviously in PIE 2.0 you've softened the language there with psychological awareness, discussing, how psychologically aware do you need to be, what sort of level of understanding.
I'm not sure I would call that softening. I would say, if anything, it's deepening. I mean, the kind of emotional empathy and so on, in some ways, is more challenging than simply having a kind of theoretical perspective. What was happening with psychological modelers, people were starting to assume that it meant something from clinical psychology, which almost always meant CBT, because that's what the health service thought was the only evidence-based thing. And it was turning into a treatment model. Well, there are a lot of treatment-oriented services, and so it worked pretty well for them, but it kind of didn't address all the needs of all the other services. It made it a bit of an elite thing, a specialist service model, a treatment service model, which wasn't what I'd intended at all. For me, the psychological model was about taking into account people's experience and valuing that, and their, and so on. So, and that was a much more humanistic kind of psychology approach, I suppose. So you could say it's a psychological model, but I just thought the word model was just getting in the way.
Yeah, I suppose I used the word softening. Maybe I should have used broadening the approach is a better word, isn't it? And making it about the understanding of people, isn't it? That's kind of what that one's about, isn't it? What level of understanding where do you take that understanding from, I suppose.
And there was a similar thing with reflective practice and evidence generating practice. I mean, reflective practice is still utterly, totally valid, but it's seen as something that happens on the front line. Whereas really what you needed to do was to get the whole organization being more, not self-critical exactly, but self-examining. And evidence-generating practice, well, if you're a psychologist and you want to write articles in psychology journals, you talk about evidence and evidence-generating. But for most people, it was just learning from the work. Learning from, and so I just thought evidence-generating practice was too narrow. We needed to open it out to make it about the attitude of the whole organization. And at that point, the idea of a culture of inquiry as against a culture of blame. I just went, whoa, yes, everybody recognizes the culture of blame. So it just needed broadening out.
Yeah.
And then those two linking together has been different aspects of the same bigger issue.
Yeah. One of the other things I was quite liked, and I found PIE 2.0 not quite liked, I liked a lot, in fact, because I've been banging on in all my communication since we started that for me, PIE is really just about relationships, isn't it? It's all about relationships between service users, staff and organizations, staff and managers. You know, everything starts with that relationship. If you can have good relationships with people, everything else can build from that. And you made relationships a central theme in PIE 2.0, rather than a separate area to look at and be managed. It's something that runs through, you know, so does the psychological awareness help you build relationships, essentially, isn't it? As you're learning inquiry, looking at how you build, you know, you can feed it in throughout it.
That was for two reasons, or two or three real reasons, really. By having relationships as a kind of separate issue, it just did seem to sort of marginalise it. Okay, we'll do with relationships over there, everything else over here, and that wasn't the reality at all. I also wanted to focus a bit more on the actual nuts and bolts, the nitty gritty of, you know, the day-to-day management, because you have got to address that. So to have relationships are central, and then the rules and roles and so on, something that you could focus on with greater precision. But that was also partly the issue that I wanted to try and get at something which was not more evidence-based exactly, and not exactly more objective, but something which was more about things you could actually observe, things you could say, yeah, we know we're doing this. Yeah, PIE's one was kind of inspirational. Yeah, which was its great strength. You know, it was all about, oh, yeah, this is so valuable, and so on. Whereas I wanted PIE's 2 to be a little bit more focused on, yeah, but what are you actually going to do?
Yeah,
you know, and so that's why taking out relationships and making it something that underlies absolutely everything. It wasn't a separate thing. You know, you do the relationships over here, and you don't deal with it under training and support. Well, no, that's. Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So there were a number of different strands, you know. But, you know, user involvement, co-production, and so on. It was happening in 2010, but it wasn't mainstreamed much in our thinking, in the way we talked about it in those original government documents. And yet that's been one of the things that's really transformed services. Yeah. And we just needed to make a space for that in the kind of roles that you can have, and thinking through the organisation using everybody's opinions and so on.
Yeah, I suppose when you say about the roles, there's the new, if you want new to the framework from the class agreement, there's the 3 R's is one of the 5 areas, isn't it, which is rules, roles and responses. And as you say, it's, you know, it's essentially, what do you do, the nitty gritty day to day, 9 to 5, 24 hours, whatever, you know, how is your service run, and how does that, you know, respond to relationships and the psychological awareness, etc. So yeah, that was another thing that I do.
The one thing I do always try and stress is that these phrases, you know, don't put them on a pedestal. Don't think, oh, we've got to do it like that because that's a proper PIE. The phrase I used in other places were, these words, these terms, they're our servants, not our masters. They're to help you think about, to help you decide for yourself where you want to go. They're not things you've got to strictly adhere to and work out every sort of detail point. They're a tool for you to use. They're not a, you know, blueprint that you've got to follow. Yeah, that's why I'm always unhappy with when people talk about implementing the PIE. Well, implementing is something you do when you know exactly what you want it to come out like at the other end. The whole thing about being a PIE is that you don't quite know what you might be able to do when you start getting everybody together and thinking about it and so on. So I tend to use introducing the PIE as a, you know, as a way of seeing things, rather than implementing it as a program. You've got to do X, Y, and Z in order to qualify as a PIE.
I tried to use the term embedding in the organisation. I think, isn't it? Embedding the PIE approach is how I sort of try to look at it. Because, like you say, it's not. I think you recently emailed me something, didn't you, to say PIEs is not a new set of things services should do. It's just a new way of looking at what you already do, what you could do, and essentially that's what PIE is.
A lens through which to see more clearly. I quite like infuse. You know, when you make a cup of tea. I think of the PIE as a bit like a tea bag.
Yes, stir it round and infuse it across.
Exactly. It really is important not to, you know, to keep a sense of humour and keep a sense of proportion. So I think the idea of the PIE as a tea bag, I'll use that another time.
I mean, that idea of looking at what you do, I suppose that's the other aspect of what I liked when I found on the PIE Inc. is that within, you know, the PIE 2.0 approach, you had already put up a very easy to use self-assessment tool. There's some quite clear guidance document that helps projects and services to look at what they do, say what's working, what's not, and, you know, try and put plans in place to address those issues. And then obviously above and beyond that, there's the PIE Abacus, the sort of digital version of that. So you know, we the organization, I've mentioned it in lots of bulletins, but, you know, for people to be aware, I've had a few services piloting this Pizazz and PIE Abacus software, but essentially that's what we will be rolling out to every service, is to look at yourselves through these assessment tools to tell us what's working and what's not, really. So yeah. I mean, did that, I suppose, did those sort of evolve at the same time as the PIE 2.0, the assessment framework?
Yes, at the point when it was about 2017, I think, January or February or so, end of January, I think it was, there was a conference with Homeless Link and Mental Health Foundation, which was supposed to be about evidence and developing the evidence for the effectiveness of PIEs and of other ways of working and so on. And that was the point at which I said, look, I think we need to refresh this whole PIEs 1 model, because there's if we want to develop evidence, it needs to be about evidence about what's happening now rather than a slightly out of date version. And I put out a call for a working party. I had about a dozen people suggesting it. Was all online, of course. But at that point, I was already in my own mind quite convinced that what we needed was a self-assessment framework rather than some kind of external adjudicating body. And there are half a dozen reasons. I mean, firstly, there'd have to be an appeals procedure. The whole thing would get desperately bureaucratic, you know, and clogged up, and it would be stuck in a version of what it was like 5 years ago. But it would take all the power and all the creativity away from frontline services, which is where I was convinced it needed to be. So I wanted a self-assessment model, and I was on the computer, you know, Googling around as you do. We call it research, but actually it's just... and I was looking for self-assessment frameworks, and I knew quite a few of them from my background as a mental health social worker, and I came across this process that had been developed for schools, and I thought, well, the schools are sort of similar in some schools are different sizes, but, you know, different age groups, different subject matters and so on, but it's basically one organization with its own staff that's trying to provide a sort of throughput experience for other people. There's enough comparable in that. The more I heard about it, the more I looked into it and then started talking with the developers, the more I thought, this is exactly the right thing for us. So even at the time when I was making that suggestion that we refresh the model, I actually had the Abacus or something comparable in the back of my mind at the time. So the two did kind of co-evolve. And I have to say, I found the Abacus team a joy to work with. They really have got the same spirit, the same idea that, you know, you don't, in education, you have Ofsted inspections, you know, with that sort of name and shame, shock and awe approach to encouraging and improving services. And that was just so utterly negative and hostile and blaming. And these guys had come up with something which was all about, you know, take responsibility for it yourself, get on the front foot, work out for yourself where your strengths and weaknesses are, and where it was just in terms of its understanding of how real change, positively beneficial change that supports the staff and brings everybody together into where you want to go. It was absolutely right for us.
I think you know, it's really the only way it can be done with PIE, isn't it? Because it's so many different services, so many different, you know, you can't say this is right for that service, this is right. It's down to you services telling us what you're doing well and what could be, you know, what we could improve on or how we could help you to improve.
And you can't produce a kind of, you know, exemplar, you know, these people are doing it perfectly. Well, it's like conversation we were having a few days ago, Anthony, I think you were part of it, where we were talking, where I was saying it's a bit like the Olympics, you know. A couple of weeks time we got the Olympic, well, we may not have the Olympics in Japan, you know, and everybody knows what winning is like, you know, you stand on the pedestal, but what wins in the sprint is completely different from what wins in the pole pole jump or the long jump or the you know, speed skating. Is there speed skating?
That's the Winter Olympics, but yeah.
Oh yeah, anyway, okay. But you get the idea. You know what what good looks like varies from place to place to place, and that's what complex needs is all about. It's about complex responses and different presentations and so on. So, you know, finding one framework that everybody could find themselves in was going to be a challenge. And it did mean that sometimes the language seems a bit abstract and a bit woolly, and you know, hold on, what exactly does that mean for us? So the downside is that people have to work on it a bit to work out what it means for you. But then the upside is that you have to work on it to work out what it means for you. It's about engaging people in the process rather than having a kind of painted by numbers version of.
I guess that's kind of my job as well, isn't it? You know, as in, you know, overseeing this stuff for the organization is when, you know, when I go to managers and teams and say, you know, let's do the self-assessment, do it together, do it with, you know, and I'm kind of there to bounce ideas back and forth on, and you say, to try and, you know, help them to see themselves in the framework, I guess, and through the assessment process. You know?
And the thing that I am very, very conscious of, when we started this 2010, you know, we were just losing the old Labour government that was prepared to put money into homelessness. But we had 10 years, not only of austerity, but of a government that, you know, basically wasn't particularly sympathetic to losers. With public concern growing about homelessness and mental health problems that weren't being dealt with by the health service. So there was the public and the politicians were kind of not going in the same direction. Suddenly COVID comes along. And all these services that have not had the funding going into them, let alone the kind of directional vision support from government. And suddenly this whammy that just like sweeps through the whole of our society. And the challenges for homelessness services that that's brought out mean that I'm quite concerned that we don't suddenly come up saying, hey guys, okay, we've got this lovely brand spanking, you know, new idea. Let everybody, and everyone's going, oh, we're struggling to get through, we're exhausted. You know, I think it's really important that although I think the whole PIEs and Pizazz and PIE Abacus is very much about appreciating and encouraging and working with and supporting staff. I mean, it's one of their key themes is staff training and support. But I think it really is important that people go at their own pace. Not kind of dragooned into it, because that way you'll get lip service and tick box stuff and so on. I really hope that people do put it over in a way I think the Wallich really has done, as a kind of energizing spirit. You know, why wouldn't you want to get involved in something that's kind of exciting and rather than, oh God, another lot of things we got to do.
I suppose you sort of hit on something there, which I came across in my survey last year, and you know, the big secret with PIE stuff really is a lot of places, I guess, and other people in the homeless sector were probably doing 90% of it before you even coined the term, weren't we, Robin? We were already
the best of places. We're doing 90% of it.
You kind of said you came up with the term to sort of describe the good practice you were already seeing, isn't it? You know, so this that's just something I try to get across to people as well. Is it's you know it's a sort of a value or a mindset really, PIE, isn't it? And it's sort of telling us what you do with it. It's not really a task list. Well, it's not a task list at all. It's just looking at what you do and telling us what's working, really. And I suppose
that's my hope, that it's helpful, encouraging, and brings people together, including to look at what you need to do and what's holding you back. One of the really interesting things is that what helps and hinders, because there are so many things which sometimes there's things within the organization's own rules and procedures that people in the front line are going, I wish we didn't have to do this. But very often those things don't come from senior management and the head office. They come from the commissioners or from other services around you that have expectations or demands or whatever. You know, there are a lot of systemic problems and we need to start tackling them.
Just about to say, one of my most exciting hopes with using the Pizazz and the Abacus is that it's our real first steps to system change, isn't it? Because if we as an organisation, the largest family charity in Wales, have been using the Abacus for a couple of years, and 80% of our services say this part of the system is a hindrance. It's a body of evidence then, isn't it, to go to that part of the system and say, look, you're a hindrance, even though you want us to work in a slightly uniform way. Can we do something about it?
And I think one particularly powerful, what's the word? A particularly powerful part of that, again another time, is that the capacity for service user involvement.
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to work on at the moment is a service user version of the Pizazz and the PIE Abacus. It may actually not need to be a different version. It may be just the way you talk about it, the way you introduce it, the way, you know, because you've got to customize it for every different population anyway. But I am seriously wondering whether that very abstract language is just it's a steep hill to climb for a lot of staff as well as for a lot of service users. And we may need to rephrase it in ways that are more about the kind of service users experience. I mean, if you've got service users on the board, you know, they're probably much more aware of the organization as a whole, but your people on the front line, it should be about what they make as they walk in through the door. As this person walks up to me, how does that feel? What are the posters? What's the lighting? What's the, you know, all that kind of stuff around the environment and around the attitude of the staff, and when things go wrong, how are they addressed, and so on. You can phrase that, I think, in terms of the service users experience.
Yeah, definitely.
You know, and if we can do that, and if they can also feed their own views into something through their own abacus.
Yeah.
And you can get like over here you've got the clients from the drug and alcohol service, over here you've got the clients from the domestic violence service who don't want to turn up in a meeting. You know, much rather something that was in the software that they didn't, you know, they can do in the safety of their own environment and so on. And the youth, you know, and the youth services and the psychiatric, and if all the service users from all those different groups are feeding in their information about what works and what doesn't in the whole systemic pathways in each local area, boy, that would be a powerful tool.
Yes, exciting. It's an exciting thought. Yeah, you can imagine the stakeholders and commissioners seeing, you know, genuine what's helping, what's hindering from the people that they are supposed to be helping and not hindering. I guess that would be that's where you get system change, hopefully, isn't it? Fingers crossed.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Hopefully. I mean, you know, I'm ambitious.
Well,
you know,
I think that's the best way to be, really, isn't it?
Well, yes.
Okay, I think probably thinking about what I was going to write in my bulletin, that's probably covered most of it, Robin. But is there anything more you want to say? I mean, I know you've got forums going on at the moment, haven't you? And you're always looking for new blood for people to attend those and sign up to the PIE link as well.
I was just going to say the only other thing I suppose I would want to do is make a plug for the forums at the moment have all been quite small groups of, you know, rarely more than a dozen, 15, 16, 18 or so people. So small enough so everybody actually gets to speak themselves. And we've had some really lovely bits of sort of people getting to know each other from one forum to another. I really, really want to carry on doing that. I think in the autumn, we may need to look at having more. At the moment, there's just 2 a week and they're just lunchtimes. We need to do something a bit larger. Like in Wales, for example, I could imagine us doing something where we invite all of the homelessness services in Wales to one big, more webinar style event.
Yeah.
So I think we do need to scale up to something which is more, you know, addressing that large area. Like how's commissioning in Wales work? What would you like to say to the Welsh government about what particular things, you know? So to get those smaller, much more intimate groups, we might need to have more of them as well, and maybe some specifically for service users.
Yeah, I think so.
And that probably won't be all just me running them, because I've only got one person's time and attention. So what I'd like to do is kind of, what's the word, provoke, spawn, encourage. What I'd hope is that we can use the platform we have here for people to sort of take it and run with it. Oh, of course, the other point I'm always trying to make is that I'm in my mid-70s. You know, it's going to have to be you guys. You know, not who's there, you. You know. You know, so I need to start bowing out and passing this over to
I mean,
Yeah,
before that happens, I would encourage everybody to go onto Piratingnet and sort of register and sign up on there, because it's a very good resource for a start, and you'll get lots of information from there. But also, you know, as these webinars and forums develop, to get information through there as well, won't they? So yeah, I'd certainly encourage people.
You don't have to be a registered member to join the forums.
Right. Okay.
On the whole, it helped because you know a bit more of the background and so on. And maybe you might decide to join later. But you know, anybody could join the forums. If anybody with a computer.
It is free to register though, as well, isn't it, Rob? It's not.
Oh yeah.
No
Yeah. And it will remain free. That's one of the advantages of the Abacus, that hopefully it will bring in a bit of income.
Yeah.
That allows us to continue to do these kind of things whilst keeping them free. That's my plan, to reinvest the income in continuing this once I've gone.
Yes, well, not just yet, hopefully, Robin. And on that cheery note, I think we'll say goodbye for today. Thanks very much for today, Robin.
It's a pleasure, and it's always good to talk to you guys. And I have to say, I really like what I see of the Wallich.
Thank you very much. Yes. See you soon.
Right, cheers.